Ruth Bretherick. I'm the Curator of Research and Public Engagement here. Thank you all so much for coming. I think this is a really great occasion to be celebrating these two wonderful exhibitions that we have in Edinburgh at the moment, at Talbot Rice and here at Fruitmarket, and celebrate the work of these two Ghanaian artists that we're showing in Edinburgh. And we were thinking earlier today about what is it about these artists that brings them together. They are Ghanaian, but there's more that connects their work than just the fact that they come from the same country. They both work in post-colonial politics of Ghana, and Mahama's practice is influenced by Anatsui's, but there's a more fundamental approach to their materials that I think is something that we'll talk about today. The way they reclaim materials, reuse, the way in which the materials carry stories of those who have used them and worked with them, and the difference between manufacture of goods and the handmade, the hand-stitched, the hand-folded, the hand-drawn, marked on, and marked skin and materials. So there's a studio practice as well between both of these artists that brings people together, that uses all the hands of all those people to bring the materials that they work with together. So I think those are some of the things that we'll touch on today. What we have done is asked both Osei Bonsu and Nana Biamah-Ofosu, I knew I'd do that, sorry, to respond to both exhibitions and think about the work of both these wonderful artists, and then Tessa and Fiona to talk together with them and talk about their curating of these two exhibitions and the process of curating and working with these wonderful artists. So I think we will start with you, Osei, if you're happy to respond.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'd just like to thank everyone at Fruitmarket and at Talbot Rice for facilitating and conceiving of these incredible exhibitions by two noteworthy artists. And it's interesting because they're artists with whom I share a personal connection, but I met them at different times in my life. Ibrahim Mahama, when I was a postgraduate student, kind of a young curator looking for kind of connections with Ghanaian artists. My father is Ghanaian, my mum is actually Welsh, so a very strange hybrid, but food is at the center of both cultures, so it works out. I was going to Ghana, I sort of said to my father, I'm going to take a year to basically find out as much as I can about Ghanaian art and make connections to the country that had been my father's home for many years, but from which I'd felt a sense of estrangement, as many people of the diaspora often do. So this is around 2015. And I remember making a kind of conscious effort to connect with a younger generation of artists who were emerging at that time, mainly out of Kwame Nkrumah University. Fiona said we'd be able to hear the trains, and it's almost like a kind of an additional installation that only adds more layers to this wonderful presentation. But what was kind of really striking is that many of these young artists were pursuing PhDs and MAs. They were kind of highly critical both of Western frameworks of modernism and modernity, but knew deeply about their sort of place within this kind of historic moment, because at that moment in time, the university had not only kind of churned out successive generations of artists, including the likes of Anatsui, that had become this kind of incredible hub, kind of incubator for new forms of practice in Ghana. And I showed up kind of hoping that I would have something to kind of learn from the students there. And I think Ibrahim Mahama was about to participate in the kind of graduate degree show. So there's as part of the campus, that I'm sure Nana knows very well because it's a kind of emblem of tropical modernism and a very important site if you do ever have the chance to visit Kumasi. There was a kind of a building, I think it was the building of finance or economics, kind of cloaked in one of Ibrahim Mahama's large jute sack hangings. And I knew very little about the materiality of the jute sack at the time, which is not that present in this exhibition, but when you Google Ibrahim Mahama, it's probably the form for which he's best known. And these are works titled The Occupation Series that really began roughly around 2013, I think, when the artist was sort of experimenting with the possibilities of sort of engaging with civic space in Ghana. And Ibrahim, fundamentally at that time, was kind of embarking on a post-studio practice. I think taking note from artists like Anatsui had sort of decided that the sort of conventional media of painting and sculpture wasn't enough, and he didn't want to participate in a practice that perhaps would lean into the kind of commodification of the art object and wanted to pursue other kind of social and political ends. So he basically created this large-scale intervention at the center of the university campus that became, in a way, the kind of probably the most notable work out of that particular group exhibition. But he was a student at that time, and what's incredible is I think it's only maybe a handful of years, 2 years later, that he's showing in the Venice Biennale at the center of Ocri and Wazor's I think 56th Venice Biennale, All the World's Futures, and that then shifted him into the kind of limelight of the global art world. But it's sort of these transgressions from local into global and what they mean and where the center is as far as it relates to how these artists want to be seen is incredibly important. Both artists have chosen to reside and remain in Ghana despite having huge international success, and I think that also speaks to a kind of Pan-African solidarity and kind of intellectual and personal commitment. But I don't want to digress too far because I want to focus a little bit more on Ibrahim Mahama and why this is such an important body of work. When Ibrahim was making the Jute Sack installations, there were kind of two key developments, you could say, within the sort of the process of putting that work together. The first involved going to usually the owner of a building. So in some cases it was a sort of an empty lot somewhere around town that was owned by a kind of developer that hadn't thought about that building for many years. In other cases it was a kind of swanky hotel that, let alone inviting artists to make things, were not that receptive to having general members of the public just walk in. So he was already kind of interested in blurring the boundary between public and private space. That was very much at the center of the work, but also asking what it meant to re-imbue these spaces with a sense of civic possibility. Because what we know about Ghana, and I'm sure Nana will speak to this, is that the sort of bifurcation specifically of Accra after the kind of period of independence has meant that much of the kind of domain that would have been held for public use is now private. It's land being developed by international corporations or it's luxury hotels. All of these kind of outputs that have not a great amount to do with local people and the needs of local people. So Ibrahim sort of transgressing these zones of private and public was in many ways a kind of critique of that. But it was also an attempt to have people look again at these spaces. So I think one of the most well-known early occupations was when he sort of cloaked one of the most noted bridges, I think a bridge up of a market in Accra, with the kind of jute sack that sort of was almost there as a kind of portal in a way. You could walk through it and around it, but it was this kind of contained space that sort of invited people to think again around how they engaged with that specific site. But I think to move on slightly, in this exhibition, you see a kind of ideological progression of those ideals in many ways. So if before he was interested purely in this idea of intervention, I think now he's sort of building new forms of civic architecture himself and thinking in a way how he operates beyond actually that role of a mere artist, which Ibrahim and I think Elle would both contest means much more than perhaps, it does much more than it says on the tin, I think, for both artists. They see themselves as being capable of shifting social narratives and kind of cultural dialogues. But I think with respect to this particular exhibition, the investment in the historical legacy of Ghana's railways, which were kind of imperative to the project of independence, but like so many forms of kind of public-owned activity, ended up being kind of derailed, sort of literally and metaphorically, by other kinds of interests. And I think when we think about the sort of repercussions of post-colonial, you could say sort of world building or nation building, there are all of these attempts to build other possible worlds that I think Ibrahim still believes are very much possible. And I think that's what I think leads his work into that of Anatsui, whose work's being presented, thanks to Tessa in large part. We were talking earlier about the trials and tribulations of just making the show happen over at Talbot Rice Gallery. And I think, again, when I first met Ibrahim, Elle's work was a kind of reference. But I think both artists are quite staunch in their sort of independence in a way, in their sort of, you could say their sort of unswayability, I don't know what the word would be, but in their kind of hard-headed commitment to a sort of individual pursuit. So I think the moment you start talking about lines of influence, they all become quite resistant and say, no, I came to that idea by myself. It wasn't, it doesn't bear the trace of any other artist. But of course, that's never entirely true. Artists are constantly taking things in and responding to things. And I think that Elle was certainly a reference, but I think by that point Elle had left Ghana. Elle left Ghana shortly after he completed his BA at Kwame Nkrumah University, the same place that Ibrahim would then go, decades later. And I think what was fascinating is he said that even though he graduated at the moment when Nkrumah became Ghana's first president, and that Ghana was being made independent in the year 1957, he didn't immediately subscribe to the logic and the politics of Pan-Africanism because he was a student. He kind of felt slightly divorced from that. And I think partly because I'm preparing an exhibition at the moment focused on Nigerian modernism and the sort of development of modern art in Nigeria, I think sometimes there is this fixation on the moment of independence as kind of this ideological break. And people sort of assuming that when independence comes, artists immediately start to change their rhythms and way of working. It's not quite that simple. There is, in some cases, a sort of complex renegotiation with what does it mean to conceive of an identity after independence, where so much of what you knew might have been predicated on your religious experience, your cultural experience, your own proximity to your own sense of difference within a particular dynamic. And I think L's entire career is about negotiating that. So he begins with a body of work mostly centered around market trays, which are not presented at Fruitmarket, but are kind of, in a way, the one missing link. And these are trays that were commissioned largely by L, again, using the third hand, using the kind of a collaborator, but he would go to individual artisans and basically ask them to carve adinkra symbols, which are these kind of aphorisms, into these plates, wooden plates, that were often used to serve fruit and veg in markets, and then bring them back into his studio, kind of rejig them and sort of rearrange them, and then present them in a gallery context. And in fact, that idea of mutability, or that idea of kind of constant change, of transition, I think in your text you refer to it as the nomadic form, he's spoken about it as the non-fixed form. This politics of transition in L's work is incredibly important. And I think what he basically does from that moment onwards of kind of reappropriating the market tray is continue quite sort of ingeniously to find other materials that have either been discarded or rendered valueless and bringing them back into a kind of new circuit of sort of ideological and metaphorical possibility. And I think that one of the most powerful stories that people often tell about Anatsui, which I think would help one to understand the importance of the works that are on view at Talbot Rice, is that towards the end of the 90s, he is sort of seeking inspiration. He's experimented with a number of metal objects, mostly printer trays, and I also think cassava graters, and discovers a bag of metal bottle tops at the bottom of an Igbo shrine somewhere in the kind of village, and he loves to walk. That's a huge part of L's kind of philosophical and artistic practice. And he sort of thinks, well, what can I do with these? Takes them back to the studio, and they kind of sit there lifeless for a long time because he can't find a way to kind of animate these things, but he knows there's something to be done with these bottle tops. And I think the first bottle top work is born, I can't correct me if I'm wrong, maybe 1998? 2001, so it's literally on the cusp of the millennium. And I think it's presented at October Gallery in 2001. And thereafter, sort of, the rest is history, as they say. But what's fascinating is that until that point, I don't know that Anatsui had been regarded as an artist of international renown. And I think two really important shifts happen. One, he kind of finds a form of material that's kind of capable of that kind of shape-shifting possibility that was at the core of his work at the beginning, this sort of ability to transfigure something very spiritual and ideological into something very physical and weighted. And another thing that happens is that the kind of international art world come knocking. Some people argued for a long time because of the works were so decorative and because they were so beautiful, quote unquote. But I think what you realize in walking through the exhibition at Talbot Rice is that there is a huge amount of beauty. You can't deny the kind of spectacular allure that these works have, particularly on members of the public that may never have encountered them before. But there is so much more happening within these works. And I think in the two first pieces that you present, freedom and solidarity, I think... Sovereignty. There is this sort of almost kind of very poetic wordplay that happens with almost all of L's work, where he's not leading you to a particular meaning or a particular understanding of the work. There is this almost this imperative that you work with him on sort of completing the meaning of the work, which I think has to do in part with his training at Kwame Nkrumah University, but also with the fact that he's an artist that still really believes in the power of the audience. And I think in both cases, Fiona was saying earlier how important it was not to do what we often do at Tate, which is to have a huge amount of interpretation telling you what to look at and sometimes how to look at it, that people were free to kind of move through this particular exhibition and make their own associations. And I think I'll probably leave it there because I don't know how we're doing for time, but just to say that I hope that, we can have a kind of broader conversation about some of these themes and narratives and that you bring your own sort of questions and queries to the fore. Thanks.
Great. That was really amazing, and lots of, I think, things that I also really enjoyed discovering in the work, both here and at the Talbot Rice Gallery. So thank you so much for this generous invitation to be here. I was in Edinburgh a few weeks ago for the Edinburgh Art Festival, so it's great to be back and to have these two incredible artists presenting work in Edinburgh is also really fantastic. I suppose maybe a bit about me and my sort of relationship to these works. I'm an architect and educator and writer, and I run an architectural practice called YAA Projects in London, and also starting to work in Ghana actually as well. And I suppose the reason for sort of mentioning that is that I think for me these two artists really remind me of a kind of legacies of home, and that's quite personal for me. I'm Ghanaian born and lived there till I was 10 when my family moved to the UK. And also there's something about their work that feels very material and architectural in both works. I think maybe perhaps more evident in Ibrahim Mahama's practice in terms of an artist who's also working with buildings. And for me in Anatsui's work, there's a sort of textural component and a sort of looseness of material that feels very sort of architectural to me, the way that it can dress a place, the way that it interacts immediately with the context, I find really beautiful. And I suppose for me, the sort of personal connection to both artists, especially Ibrahim's work, was I sort of encountered both their works at a time where I was really starting to investigate architecture, not just in kind of London and Europe where I've studied, but also elsewhere, especially home in Ghana. And that sort of searching for a kind of different architecture also brought me in contact with a different art. And I do think that those two things are very much interrelated, especially in the Ghanaian context. Osei has mentioned this Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, and it's really interesting to see how the architecture department there and the art department sort of, I think at one point were much more in conversation and then a sort of departure. And it always makes me think about why art is able to carry such difficult conversations and sort of expressions, whereas architecture is sometimes a bit slower to kind of respond to that. And for me, I think my first encounter with Ibrahim, I was doing a writing program called New Architecture Writers, and we were putting together a small symposium, and we titled it Drawing the Edge to the Centre. And I'd invited him to be part of a panel discussion we were giving, and the reason for that was because of this thing that you said about the way that his practice sort of, for me especially, shifts the conversation in kind of Ghana's kind of art scene and art practice from a kind of, in Ghana, I'd sort of suggest that a lot of the art practice is quite concentrated in Accra, and his practice really sort of geographically shifts that. He's intentionally based in Tamale, which I find really powerful actually, and I think it does something to a sense of geography and a sense of meaning, and also thinking about a country as a whole. And so I was really interested in how he sort of that intentionality with choosing to be based not in Accra but elsewhere, and that the work that is then therefore being produced as a result of that. And I suppose I came to sort of know Anatsui's work a bit later, but for me there's something really beautiful and charming about the sort of materiality. And also I found his own personal history also really interesting, as a Ghanaian born artist who'd studied then and went to teach in Nsukka in the southeastern part of Nigeria. And there is a sort of familiarity with that, but also a certain kind of geographical sort of strangeness. It's not Lagos, it's Nsukka, and I think that's, for me, says quite a lot. And actually both places, so Kumasi, KNUST and the University of Nsukka, have very interesting art practices that sort of emerged, especially around the sort of, I'd say, early years of independence. And in Nsukka and Igbo land is also interested in its own kind of sort of tensions with ideas about independence. And for me, it's really interesting to reflect on the works that are being shown here in Edinburgh in relation to the artist's own geographies and where they come from. And it was really beautiful here in Anatsui to talk about his connection to Scotland and the sort of, you know, his, the way that books came from Scotland for him, or paints came from Scotland. I thought that was really interesting, the sort of memories that both artists, I think, are exploring. They're exploring a certain kind of memory of home in their work, but also where that home is also geographically linked to, and I find that really quite compelling. And I think in doing so, they also reveal something about Scotland's own colonial heritage and sort of legacies of coloniality that are held here in cities like Edinburgh. And I think that there's something, perhaps maybe that's not the centre of the work, but it's always sort of, for me, in the kind of in memory when thinking about these works. I suppose for me it's perhaps more at the forefront when I'm looking at Ibrahim Mahama's work here and the kind of memories of trade that he's pulling in his work, and ideas about industry, which also for me also rely on something about extraction. And there's a kind of, when I read his work, there's a sort of reading of geography that is taking place. The first for me is a sort of a geography mapped not by people but by extraction of kind of manufacture and making. That you're able to read a country, a territory, through the lens of what was being taken, how that material was being moved, the sort of people that were also then moved with those materials. And then the other layer is perhaps a much more human sort of geography of stories and memories carried through a certain materiality. So I really enjoy these pieces here and his series of works that sort of look at the skins of women who, I know the Ghanaian term, the Kayo ladies, who sort of whose skins are marked with ideas of their kind of identity, where they come from. And I've heard it literally described as so that should anything happen to them, they know where, the people know where they should be returned to. And I think there's something deeply compelling about that, about marking on one's skin or one's body this idea of trade and manufacturing and the sort of coming and going of materials that also you know, sort of brings and focus that sort of human element in this story of the sort of transition of goods and materials. And must have been about 4 years ago, I was the first time I visited Ibrahim's kind of now quite growing complex of buildings in Tamale, which are just absolutely fantastic. And if you ever find yourself in Ghana, I would hugely recommend the journey north to go to these buildings, because they're just extraordinary. And I think for me, it really reveals something that he talks about a lot in his practice, about the sort of transformation of arts from commodity to a gift. And I really do believe that that's at the centre of his practice, this idea of art's not as just as something to sort of look at, to encounter, but something that's a gift, something to be lived with. And I've always found that sort of way of thinking about art and making, especially in kind of Ghanaian culture, really interesting, that art is not something to be kind of just observed, it's a living thing, it's a thing that people make and live with. And I find that comes through in how he makes his art, the kind of ways in which they're always made with other people. And there's a sort of generosity and also telling you about the labour of others that go into their art. So I found the videos that are presented here really compelling, just the kind of sheer number of bodies, of hands, of voices that have gone into the labour of these things, and you're always reminded and in encounter with this idea of labour in the work. And I also found that really beautiful in the exhibition at Talbot Rice when you were talking, Tessa, about the ways in which the art and Anatsui's work always asks you to respond with it in the space. So you yourself, as a curator, as a technician working with that, with his work, are also thinking about your own labour in encountering these works. And I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I'll start to wrap up a bit. But for me, there's something that across both artists, they're sort of things that really jump up when I'm encountering these works, which are ideas about industry, about geographies, and about kind of a future by reference and a kind of material past, which I find really interesting. So, thank you.
There were so many things to respond to, but I want to make sure that we leave enough space. But one of the things I neglected to mention, and it's because I'm kind of so dropped in now as it relates to both artists' work, but I had the privilege of working with Anatsui on the Turbine commission, which opened at Tate last year and ran through the spring of this year, and then will go on to open in China, I think at the end of this month. But it's one of the things that I think you articulated so beautifully there is this sense of labour that's in both practices, but that it's not without a generosity, and they're not trying to conceal the third hand. Yeah. It's not a kind of, look what I made, I'm responsible for this kind of great thing, but there's a kind of ability, I think, to think about the material transactions that happen in the making of the work as being as much a part of the work as the end result. And it means that actually, because both artists are kind of determined to build community around their practices, they're almost kind of self-sustaining. Yeah. And I think if you look at the way that Elle's practice in Ghana functions, there's a kind of studio manager. There are roughly 13 to 14 people working in Ghana alone, and then maybe 30 to 40 people working in Nsukka. And often these bottle top works are being shipped between either country across borders to be worked on. And it's only actually when they arrive at Talbot Rice that their kind of final form is fixed. And then, of course, unfixed when those are de-installed. But in that process, Tessa and her invigilators and her team become an extended part of Elle's studio. And that's something we often joke about at Tate in a way, is that we're all kind of employed by Anatsui at some level. And I think when you meet him, that will come into view. But he has this remarkable ability to draw people in. And I think Ibrahim similarly takes very seriously the institutional dialogues that he builds. So I know that for Fiona, putting the show together felt especially relevant because of the site, and in fact it was a complete sort of response of thinking through the ways in which Ibrahim's work might activate a wider set of questions around the Fruitmarket's own positioning. But I think as it relates to kind of colonial histories, one of the things I think both artists do really successfully is find a way to invite us into these understandings of the impact of coloniality, and in a way the rhetorics of decoloniality, but not in ways that are necessarily telling you exactly about a certain historical event or a moment in time, but this sort of slow unfolding. If you think about the bottle cap alone, this is a form of commodity that was introduced to Africa in the 15th century, but Elle is dealing primarily with bottle tops that are a product of Nigeria, so are very much of the contemporary moment. And in fact, the process of procuring those bottle tops is one that it's an industry he's created. Mm-hmm. So now you have individuals in Nigeria who go around and work on behalf of Anatsui to procure those materials. But I think there's so much else, but I just wanted to say I think that connection to labour is so important, because I think both artists take very seriously the individuals who are very much part of the body of the work.
It's the artistry of it as well, seeing the portraits being made by everybody that Ibrahim's collaborating with, but it's finding evidence in Al's work, which is more abstract, obviously. When you zoom in on these surfaces, you can see the handiwork of individuals in there that is so different from one another. Yeah. And as you can see it very well in the Scottish Mission Book Depot Keta, the yellow work. And as I discussed it with Al, we were talking about it, and he said at the beginning he was quite controlling of it, like he wanted it to be done his way, and the piecing together his way, and after a while he began to understand this was just entirely uncontrollable. He was going to have to go with how people created themselves. and started to see that you can see also the organization of somebody's mind and how they tessellate, how they put these shapes together. Some are very tightly packed, some are very loosely woven, but you start to see, as in Ibrahim's portraits as well, the individual artists that he's collaborating with coming through, and their own characters and forms coming through as well.
I think it's that, and I don't know about El and Anatsui, but I know for Ibrahim that there's something in that. Working with other people is about deliberately sort of shucking off the sort of aura of the big artist, the big successful individual artist, and wanting to operate as part of the community and literally reject that very capitalist notion of the person, the author, the big sort of indexical author of the work. And he, certainly, Ibrahim surprised us, I think, with it. Obviously, I know about him as an employer is extraordinary. I think he's one of the greatest employers in Northern Ghana. He has lots of people working with him. He pays them really well. What I wasn't expecting, and I didn't know that El did it too, that he would co-opt all of us to quite the same extent. I mean, a lot of it, the beautiful vitrine made with found wood over there is made by Colin, our senior technician. The rails downstairs asked where he wanted them sourced here. They're sourced by Davide. The work has been made here, a lot of it, and will now go back to Tamale and exist in Ghana. And he wanted that sense of bringing his work here, but also bringing our labour back there, and making sure that the two, that the relationship between Britain and Ghana was disturbed in some way by our labour as much as by theirs, which I think is really interesting.
There's also a sense of bringing back materials that had come from here originally, materials that were built in Britain and taken over to Ghana to build the railways when at the turn of the century, at the beginning of the century. So, and he seemed really keen to bring those back. That disturbance is a kind of a historical one that resonates from the beginning of the century, right until now. So I found that a fascinating way of working as well. To start with, I thought this seems like a cheat to get these rails from the UK, but actually it was so integral to the way that Ibrahim was thinking. It wasn't just to do with the fact that it takes quite a lot of effort to get railways from Ghana over here. It's also part of the way that he was thinking about the materials and their history.
Well, again, because he wants to co-opt the materials we have here. I mean, the steel of the... Ibrahim calls the warehouse the steel room, and I think we probably ought to rename it because it makes it perfect sense. But the steels of the warehouse were built at the same time by the same people on the same materials and the railway of the Gold Coast, and are stamped in the same way. So there is a certain co-opting of the building as well as all the people in it, which is really interesting. And we are now, it's not just a reasons of money and sustainability. We didn't ship the rails from Ghana because we're shipping them back. They are travelling about.
I was going to pivot slightly to the subject of education, because I think one of the things that I think has already been teased out is the fact that both artists have a deeply rooted connection in universities. And one of the things I neglected to mention is that what made the moment of independence so profound as it related to specifically to academia and to kind of the teaching of art specifically is that it allowed, for the first time in many African countries, but I think maybe Kwame Nkrumah University might have been the first to liberate itself from the UK curriculum. Until that point, most art schools were teaching with a kind of curriculum and a syllabus that was inherited from Goldsmiths University or the University College London, but these sorts of inherited methodologies, you could say, and practices of education that were enshrined in colonial culture. And actually it's when, even though El entered university after the winning of independence, in fact he found that it wasn't a particularly inspiring context to work within, and he found that the kind of educational structure of Kwame Nkrumah University, despite being one of the most radical, felt to El, well, it would become one of the most radical, felt to El at that time very much entrenched in the kind of values of European or British colonial education. So he left for Nsukka for that very reason. And then when Ibrahim arrives decades later, you have the individual caricature Seido, who's represented in this image over here, who's leading that art department and is mentioned in the text. But caricature, I think, is sort of at the forefront of why so many of these artists are thinking about their wider responsibility to Ghana beyond actually the fact, because if you tell a Ghanaian parent that you're studying art, I mean, it's almost akin to telling them that you're, I can't even think of an equivalent. But it's like you're opting out of all of those expectations, you know, all of the reasons that they sort of invested into your education or brought you up right are kind of undermined in the moment that you say that you're going to become an artist. Because embedded within that is this idea of uselessness, and this idea that somehow you're kind of forfeiting your sort of your commitment to family, to the kind of virtues you could say that are upheld within the majority of capitalist societies. But because in many cases certain artists are the first generation within their family to attend university. And I think that within the diaspora and actually in Ghana. So I think what's fascinating in the case of Caricature is he kind of encourages artists to lean further into that by not necessarily producing, you know, the graduate work that might be expected or having them sort of flirt with the art market. He's much more interested in them finding their own ideological solutions to this problem of what does it mean to be an artist. And I think for many of them, Anatsui is the template. So it's sort of funny, I think Ibrahim's almost building a new form of practice now in Ghana that's providing a model for many others. But I think in so many ways it has to do with caricature, and the bats that you see flying there are a reference to the bats that were uncovered when Ibrahim excavated an old grain silo, which I believe is now the site of either Red Clay or Savannah Contemporary.
In Volini.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of idea and reference to that, but also this idea, I think, of what we were talking about earlier of returning that thing that was kind of, you know, ultimately excavating the archive and thinking about the possibility of kind of sort of reanimating the ghosts that live within the archive. And I think that comes up in the artist's work in different ways. In Elle's work, it's often through the kind of titles of the work, much more kind of subtly, because he doesn't work a great deal with archive. We kept trying to get him at Tate to kind of engage with the history of the building, but Elle was much more interested in how his work would fix, or how he would relate to the building, rather than how the building would relate to his work. And I think that speaks volumes about his kind of sense of his own voice, actually, as an artist, this absolute confidence in his own conviction, in his own ability. But I digress.
I mean, the devil is in the detail with these works, and looking into the archive and the materials. I mean, I get completely transfixed with these works, reading the relatively boring administrative language and the stories that you hear and the tales of trying to get an individual advanced in his wage. But it's quite similar with Al, particularly in the works that are using the printing press plates now. Because in these, you'll read real details as well. There's the Nigerian national anthem that's just switched again. Yeah. And so it's the one that was there before. And all these little details that are inside, as well as the, you know, liquor brands, and kind of thinking, are they Ghanaian, are they Nigerian, what would they have been? It's interesting to go back to that time, that story that you tell, Ruth, of buying the sleepers here, but you're going to eventually take them back to Ghana. You know, alcohol, when it was coming into Ghana at that time, was a trade spirit. You talked about it, Osei, but it's a very important idea to just dwell on a little, because it was the second biggest import to Ghana after textiles, and was traded for enslaved humans. So although this is not the same alcohol bottling top of that time, it's made for the Nigerian and Ghanaian industry today, they are very heavily haunted, loaded materials, and it's very much how and why Al brings the really serious geopolitics and historical analysis of the colonial project into his work.
And Kabina Mercer refers to them in a text that we commissioned for the Tate publication as debtor chips, and no one's ever called Elle's bottle tops debtor chips before, but I think when you think about them in that way, it's an entirely new kind of world of possibility opens up, not only in terms of the interpretive meaning of the works, but also thinking about what would it mean to trace each one and connect it back to either an individual or a company or an industry that's directly linked, not only to the sort of histories that you talk about, you know, the sort of storied histories that relate to colonial extraction, but kind of present day narratives that subtend the politics around alcohol. So there's so much to be said in that alone, but yeah.
I think that there's a really interesting idea about archiving here. I'll say you touch on the fact that Elle's work is not necessarily always so deeply rooted in the archival, but there is something, I think, really beautiful in that they're just a kind of living archive, all these collections of objects, these ideas of being able to trace a sort of moment, or you sort of become quite transfixed on one, and you think, what's the story there? And actually these sort of bottle tops, there's something so ubiquitous about them, so everyday in them, that sort of tell a story that is not the sort of official sort of state narrative, but a sort of difference. And I recently worked on an exhibition with the V&A on tropical modernism in Ghana, and then later also in India. And one of the things I found really fascinating about doing that work and the research was talking to my co-curator and just saying, we're not going to find lots in a proper archive, the sort of ways that you would encounter, but the archive exists in people's homes, exists in people's, actually one of the biggest sources of archival materials for us was the sort of boys and girls associations of the old schools, because actually people have such other connections, and those are sort of how these archives are formed. They're formed through people's stories, their own photographs, their own memories. So I find this sort of everydayness is present in Elle's work through the kind of materiality of these just very mundane, everyday sort of bottle tops. But they also have a kind of currency. And it reminds me a bit of the sort of cowrie shells that were actually currency along that sort of coast of that goes, Ghana and also Benin, Togo, and Nigeria. All of those. There's a sort of memory of that idea of a currency, of something to be traded. And then in Ibrahim's work, the sort of surface on which these drawings are made are kind of records of trade, so they record a kind of currency and exchange. So there is something about embedded in both of those that is a kind of an archive, but it's just every day. It's not necessarily trying to say this is a kind of official archive, but it's a memory, an everyday sort of working memory and legacy of a country and a place.
It also makes you think about how nations often document their own histories, and I've often thought about this in the context of contemporary Africa, where we have issues around heads of state being well beyond their sort of maybe sort of outstaying their purpose or their term at least. And I think that there is maybe a sense, I think, among many artists on the continent that they're committed in a way to imagining other possible worlds, and so often that has to do with a kind of reclamation of the ideological past. And I think people look to heads of state like Nkrumah and some figures like Senghor, Jomo Kenyatta, all of which were kind of heads of state at this moment of sort of the sort of frenzied nation building that was happening at that time, where all of these new civic structures were being put in place. But I think what we also have in both Anatsui's practice and Ibrahim Mahama's is this kind of confrontation with the politics of the global, and the fact that Ghana is now so interconnected to the systems that are going on elsewhere in the world, that to kind of only dwell on this kind of ideological past isn't helpful somehow. But it's this sort of leaning full steam ahead into a sort of a difficult future. And I think that negotiation throughout this exhibition is so important. I think one of my favourite works within this show is the work that brings together the kind of ensembles, the sort of photographs that are reproduced as kind of cut-out drawings of workers from the railway, from the railway, who effectively are given a voice in that installation downstairs, maybe for the first time in history. And I don't know whether the record of their ideas, their expressions would have ever been held otherwise. And it's artists, I think, that still have this incredible power to take something so granular and to kind of expand it to be something so much greater than the sum of its parts. And I think that comes through in both Elle's practice and Ibrahim's.
I think there's a connection though between what you're both saying and this idea of the gift as well.
Yeah.
Because, and it's to do with the economy, I think, especially that Elle has driven around his practice. And the question of why, being able to imagine something different and a different way of being, it doesn't in any way appear to me to be about personal wealth. When I visit him in Tema, this institution that he's built, it is for other people, it is going to be for students, it's for the community. And it's the same with Ibrahim, isn't it, what he's doing? And it's just an extraordinary idea of building a greater scenario. But what I find really fascinating about it is reading about how Elle made that happen. It wasn't like the chances and the luck of the market. He drove those prices up. There are articles, I mean, I don't think it's inappropriate for me to talk about it. Jack Shaman talks about it. He's on the record talking about it. And it's just, I mean, they're eye-watering now, and what he's able to do with that for the people of Ghana and for this new emerging artistic community, the people that he supports, the people that have come to me and told me stories about Al's support of them. And
there is a really fascinating thing that I think for many artists in the room might be a kind of good note to self, that Al employs lots of his students. So often the sort of, there was a moment where it was sort of an unofficial rite of passage. If you were doing an MA at Nsuka University, you would probably end up going to work for Anatsui in some capacity. And I think what's so interesting is that many of those students then went on, you know, they include individuals like Nana Okere, Chika Okeke-Agulu, and many others who sort of built their practices sort of in response to their experience of working with Al. But I think to your point about the kind of commercial drive, actually, that both artists have sort of led, I'm sometimes critical of it, because I do think sometimes there is a disparity between the way Western institutions, not only in the art world, sort of value individual artists, but maybe are not that engaged with, you could say the sort of, the sort of social and intellectual context out of which these works emerge. So there's an idea that by the time they end up at an art fair, they go onto a gallery wall, they can sometimes feel that they're being divorced from that context to an extent, or their value is only one of a commodity rather than something that is a living thing, as you said earlier. And I think that that is something that both artists are kind of actively pushing back against in many instances. So I would say that for Anatsui, it was important, like you said, that he kept a kind of control over his studio environment, but that it kind of, he made a really important point. It was a very simple one, but I said, you know, when did the works get bigger? He said, when I could afford a bigger studio. And he said the ambition of the work only grew in kind of in parallel with the sort of the sheer value that he could invest back into the practice. And I think that's important to think about, that there's value as it relates purely to the kind of monetary, but then there's also the value added that's associated with jobs and opportunities and economies that are vital when we consider that so many of the artists who graduate, not only in Ghana but around the world, aren't always met with the best prospects as far as it relates to employment. So I think that there's something really important about thinking about these artists as kind of building institutions, and those institutions being, in a way, built with the purpose of outliving those artists.
And
so,
built with the proceeds of this.
Yeah.
I mean, I was absolutely dumbfounded when Elizabeth and I sitting having lunch with Ibrahim the first time he was over here. Really, really simple. It's like, you always know, this is what I'm interested in about your work, perhaps you can tell me about what interests you. And he's like, what interests me is taking the materials of Ghana, making work out of it, shipping that work into the international art market, turning it into money, and bringing the money back home and spending it in Ghana, on Ghana, for Ghana. That's what it's all about. It's surplus capital, and I will transform it, and I will use it to transform people's lives. Yeah. And the socialist project of that, and I got completely over-emotional, and I always will, you know, we agreed so completely on what art is for, and how artists can make a space for people to think through the hard kind of things that you've been talking about, exchange and commodity, and the horrors, really, of contemporary global world. But at the same time, so the art can give us a space to do that, he believes most sincerely, but also, very tangibly, art can make money, and money can be used to do good things.
Yeah, I think it's really, I find that really interesting, really compelling. What you were saying earlier, say, about the sort of, I suppose, friction sometimes and the challenge we're talking about, that I really enjoy that in Ibrahim's work and the sort of discourse around his work, that very immediate understanding of how art can be a gift because it can generate capital, which does the sort of gift giving and the sort of creation and cultivation of a place, of a society, of a community, and affords them that ability to kind of keep making art that is living, that is part of their kind of everyday. And it's one of the things I find so fascinating about the Savannah Centre for Contemporary Art and the Parliament of Ghosts that's there, and just seeing the kind of complete transformations of it, activations of it, is so powerful, because it reminds you of this kind of openness. And for me, it is really fascinating that it's still completely free, it's open to the whole to any member of the public, and it's a place that I think it's really now embedded in the kind of sort of urban tapestry and fabric of Tamale.
People don't have their wedding photographs.
Yeah, it's part of a kind of a community, and I even think about it's made out of brick. There's a certain earthiness that it feels like it belongs to the place, and the sort of being there, you might see a young local boy coming to look at this art, and it's probably also the first time that I know certainly growing up in Ghana, there's a sort of detachment with a sort of a nation's history. So there's the stories that are told, the sort of official sort of narratives that you grow up knowing, but it took me a rather long time to understand the kind of complexities actually of the colonial project, these ideas about trade, about materials coming and going, the sort of record keeping of all this. That's another story that is very different from the sort of official sort of state legacy and stories that are told. And I think for a young person to be able to come to a place like this and encounter
Okay. Doesn't have to be mic'd when you're coughing.
Yeah, no. Well, you didn't expire whilst mic'd up, but you have a break.
But I was going to actually follow on from that to make a point about a slightly sort of a biographical note. I mean, Ibrahim's father works in construction.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is that, and there's so many things that we might miss because we're sort of, again, sort of entrenched in the worlds of these artists, but one really important thing is that the jute that Ibrahim started out with was a product initially of Southeast Asia. It's then shipped to Ghana and used to bag various goods. In the first case, actually, it's stamped by the Ghana Cocoa Board, and then once it's reached the end of its kind of useful life as a container of cocoa, it's then given to local market traders to bag all other sorts of produce that are usually brought from the north down to Accra, and then basically given a life within the context of various consumer cycles. But in that process, it's these individual women that you were mentioning earlier who mark these sacks with their names as well as other, let's say, tradesmen along the way. And I think what's imperative about understanding that is that link to Tamale, if you imagine a part of the country that isn't considered really an industrial or cultural centre in the way that it is perhaps now that Ibrahim is kind of building an interest around it, but that has to do with something that I know you can understand very much in relation to your own practice, because it's about this notion of soft architecture and this idea of not necessarily needing to build physical structures, although Ibrahim has created these physical structures, but more sort of leaning into the possibilities of what does it mean to think about the power of what happens when communities come together to kind of create other forms of knowledge making. And I think in that case, maybe Ibrahim more so than El, but I know it's now more and more a part of El's practice, what does it mean to rethink this question of the museum? Because so often when we talk about this idea of the exchange of objects that end up becoming prized within an art historical canon, think about the kind of ideological resting place of being a museum. And, sort of you could say that that's the model that we're stuck with in the West, and it may be the only model for the foreseeable future. But I think that there is something about learning from these artists, about other ways of thinking about the power of an institution, and I know that both Fruitmarket and Talbot Rice kind of do represent an alternative within the landscape of Edinburgh's art scene and Scotland as a whole. Hats on the back to both of my colleagues here. But I think that's really critical, and I know certainly, and this is again is a bit biographical and probably too anecdotal, but when I was a student at Central St Martin's College of Art, the idea that there would be 2 Ghanaian artists showing in Scotland at one time was inconceivable. I would have thought, that's way off, maybe 2070. And I think it's just so important, I think, that both Talbot Rice and Fruitmarket are sort of thinking about their proximity to these artists in the long term, because it shouldn't just be this exchange that only lasts for the duration of an exhibition, but what does it mean to think about the possibility of, I'm putting some pressure on Fiona here, but shows going from Fruitmarket to Tamale in the future, how would that look? How would one conceive of a more horizontal form of collaboration that isn't predicated on a kind of show and tell that we're so used to within frameworks of the white cube, but a different mode of exchange, a different kind of institutional currency. So I think you're doing that work with this exhibition, and I think it's hopefully the beginning of a kind of rich dialogue. And I think that both artists, and I would say, to give credit to Ibrahim, this idea of centering school groups that I know you do here as well, the idea that at any one time, I think, almost on a daily basis, there are school groups visiting Tamale. Yeah. Those are individuals that probably won't ever get an opportunity to visit a national gallery because there really isn't one in Ghana. There is a cultural centre. Yeah. There is a kind of where you can learn more about the history of Ghana, but in terms of art being centred, that's something that you don't encounter. So it's quite radical, actually, what both of these artists are undertaking. We see the results of it here, but actually the impact is so much more than the work itself.
I've learned more about what the Fruitmarket can be from this exhibition, from working with Ibrahim, than from anyone else.
Yeah.
In terms of how you run an institution for people, he knows more about that than anyone I've ever met. Yeah. And as you say, at any one time, there's 400 or 500 kids crawling all over what he's doing, and he's interested in that. And I think, obviously we know, Ruth looks after our archive. We're doing an awful lot of work at the moment on the 50-year history of the Fruitmarket. This show will have reverberations for years. This show will reverberate, and as will Els around Edinburgh. We know there are students, we'll see this work coming out and these ideas coming out. But just back to the kind of disruption of the museum, it's really important for me that we have the film downstairs showing the work being made, which came in, which Ibrahim was finishing as we were installing the work. It came in maybe 5 minutes before. Really important to him that obviously you were saying this to you earlier, you hang these shows, they look incredibly elegant, and he's like, I think it's really important that your audience sees the mess in which this was made. We're handling it really carefully, we're wearing our gloves, we've turned it absolutely into work that can be seen as an artwork, but he really wanted it to take it back to what it was like when he was digging it out of the trains and in its context, and just disrupting that museum-y expectation of it, bringing a bit of Ghana into here, as well as the fact that some of here will go back. It seems, it's a new way of thinking. I think it's a new way of thinking for us that I hope we'll be able to carry on.
I think it relates also to how you were describing how I've had the extraordinary experience of shaping those Anatsui, because to do it with your own hands and with the technicians, of course, it's just, you must agree.
I wasn't allowed to touch it.
You would love to. I couldn't get enough of it.
So I'm forever jealous of Tessa, because actually in the process of hanging the exhibition at Talbot Rice, there was a much more, let's say, casual installation process, partly maybe because she's a director, she took more liberties than I would have dared to, but I think when it comes to installing a work in a conventional museum setting, it's our art handlers that actually do all of that work, and many of them actually got cuts and bruises from the wires, because of course affixing all of these bottle tops is this copper wire that's incredibly sharp. And you graze your hand and it can draw blood, and I think that interestingly that kind of blood, sweat and tears, quite literally, that went into the Turbine Hall installation meant that when everyone sat down, again, it's an aside, but most Turbine Hall commissions are fabricated outside of the artist's studio. So more often than not, an artist works with a fabricator in London, sort of draws up a plan, they work very collaboratively, usually with an architect, and they come to a kind of a technical solution after they come to an artistic one, because there's such an emphasis on scale with the Turbine Hall. Els' work was entirely handmade. So it meant that literally it was the only Turbine Hall commission where the entire work was produced in the artist's country of origin, then shipped to the UK via sea freight. First time Tate had done that. Usually it's fabricated in the UK. And I think then on top of that, ensured that the team at Whitewall, who are the collaborators, literally get involved and get stuck into piecing the work together. And I think the largest work, which is the sail that you saw as you come in, similar in kind of scale in terms of its kind of enveloping nature to the yellow work that you see when you enter the Talbot Rice, was made up of 17 individual pieces that had to be brought together, kind of pieced together like a puzzle. So I think that handling of the work is really important, but I think it's something that we don't encourage people to touch the work when they're in the gallery, but I would also say that one of the things that we do, and I think Talbot Rice should do it if it isn't already doing, is for people who are otherwise impaired, who would like to explore the work in different ways, or we're just curious about the materiality. We did a touch wall at at Tate, which I'm sure
Yes.
you have too. So.
Sarah and
People
Sunny
everywhere.
and Elif have been
Yeah.
sharing these touchable items for
Yeah.
the last 3 months. But I think it's
Cool.
quite interesting to also talk about that shaping and how he shares it with you, how he allows you into his world, because he wants you to interpret it too. It's not just a passive kind of manual labor thing. It's like, what are you making of this? So as we were describing it, we were discussing the Salisbury Crags, the volcanic surrounds of Edinburgh a lot, and whether we could make those forms within it. And there was a time when I started thinking, we should commission Lucy Lippard to write about Anatsui, because this is getting into the zone of institutional critique and like, what is the where does the white cube finish? Where does the practice begin? So I wanted to make that point in relation to museums and galleries and the kind of complicating that he does with that. But also that idea of a live artwork, which is something I believe actually about all artworks in the kind of Claude Lévi-Strauss sort of a way. They're always accumulating knowledge. But when we're sitting in the Georgian Gallery and we were describing the floor plan, and we had Royal Slumber, an artwork called Royal Slumber, and it was going to be in the cupola room that was full of light. And he just looked at me and he said, "But how will he sleep?" I was just like, oh dear God, lie down. And so we built him this cavernous, black, darkened space on which the king can sleep. And it was one of the moments, when something just clicks into place in your understanding of an artist and how deeply they believe in not just the materials, but the spirituality of the meaning that he gives them through their titling, but also the form and the shape that you start to find within it, but that they're alive and they can hear you and they'll notice you when you visit. And we ask on the wall text, we ask people to be quiet and to come in quietly.
I wonder whether part of that has to do with, and it's something I can't speak to in depth, but the sort of multi-faith nature of even contemporary Ghanaian culture. I mean, Elle was raised Christian, Ibrahim Mahama is a practicing Muslim, but who acknowledges, as many artists do in Ghana, the sort of coexistence and cohabitation of all of these different forms of faith and religious expression. And I think this idea of spirituality is deeply present in both artists' work in a way, but I would say in Elle's work in particular, there is almost this sort of attempt, I think, to think about, I refer to it as a kind of sublime in a way, because there is this kind of transcendental quality to the works which forces you to think about the power of art kind of beyond mere impression or sort of surface. And I do think that there is maybe a way in which, just to, again, redirect slightly, the way it's maybe worth noting about the institutional history of Anatsui's practice here in the UK. So he has his first exhibition at October Gallery in the late 90s, as part, actually 95, in conjunction with the Africa season, which took place. It was probably the first time that the UK did any kind of major showcasing of African art, and it's where the show 7 Stories of Modern African Art was held at Whitechapel, and there were subsequent exhibitions all around. But if you look at the critical response to much of Elle's work during that time, it's decorative, it's reductive, it reminds us of Klimt, it looks like something else. And I do think there is a way in which, not to dwell too much on the sort of critical, sort of erasure or undermining of African artists over a period of time, but there is something, I think, to be said about how these exhibitions are a kind of testament to how central these artists are within the discourse of a global contemporary art landscape, and that it's not just about their Africaneity as being important. Fiona is not just interested in Ibrahim Mahama because they've never shown an African artist before, for example, which is how many people would often talk about African art, as this idea always of it needing to be a first or a kind of opening up. And I think that there is maybe a shift that is in large part to do with individuals like Okwinweso, who championed both artists individually. He gave Anatsui the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale in 2015, and then that was also the year that Ibrahim had his first major exhibition, or first major inclusion in a Biennale. And I think what he was interested in, he used to refer to Ibrahim's works as masculine, which now hasn't aged well, that idea. But I think the works are neutral, although there were a lot of men in this exhibition, actually, when you come to think about it. So maybe Okwi was onto something.
No, these are all women.
Well, these are all women. But I was looking at the figures around, but I wanted to make a point about the fact that, there was a moment, I think, in which these artists could have very much been seen as kind of peripheral. And I think when Anatsui was awarded the Golden Lion, there was a sort of shift that happened, But I think that there is also maybe an attempt, I think, within this exhibition to kind of think about the kind of importance of a body of work, which is so important. I think so often the participation of these artists would have been in group exhibitions where you don't have this kind of in-depth insight and acknowledgement. But Anatsui was entirely unfazed about the lack of critical recognition of the work, and to put it into context, the woodworks that you see when you're entering the gallery were only ever acquired by encyclopedic museums, so places like the Brooklyn Museum or the Met, but never by museums like Tate and MoMA, because they were seen as African art with a sort of capital A, to suggest that they were woodworks and therefore they had an affiliation to a kind of tribal specificity or an ethnic specificity that made them kind of unworthy of being deemed works of contemporary production. So I think both artists, you know, to make a bigger point, are kind of shifting the logic of what the art world conceives as being important. And I think that's something that we need to continue to kind of have a dialogue around, because I do still find that, you know, when we unveiled the Turbine Hall Commission, I think it was something, there was a headline, something like, artist turns trash into treasure, and I thought, well, nice, but how reductive that that's what you took away, trash to treasure. Well, I guess you could say it's incredibly lazy, but it's one way of talking about a much more complex process that's happening within Elle's work. But I still do find in the rhetoric around many African artists, this desire to reduce their work to something much more basic is still very much present.
That lack of recognition or space that Al had, we've talked about it a few times. But it was actually painting that drew me to Al. I wanted to make a painting show. And every time my head was filled with my favourite painters, he was just everywhere inside the head. And so when they did the show in House de Kunst, I thought, oh, I'm going to have to go and see it. And of course, that was the exhibition that Okwe and Weezor made with Chika Okekeogulu, and he passed away just before
as it opened.
So it was hugely, hugely sad, and there was the book of condolences at the desk when you visited. But it was also the place in which Al made Rising Sea, which before your show was the largest indoor work he'd ever made, and then Scottish Mission Book Depot Keta is the other. It's the other of the scale of Rising Sea. And I was sat in front of this abstract artwork, weeping, and it was something to do with Okwe, but it was also a lot to do with the ecological concerns in the artwork. You feel this like rising sea that is coming up to envelop you, but it was also the pure physical scale of abstract sculpture and what it can do to you. And a woman walked up to me, she put her hand on my leg and she just said, "You're not the first." And there was just something, there was something in that gesture that just, I will forever be charged about the potential for art from that gesture that she made. But the thing that really nailed my conviction to make the exhibition with Al was meeting with the curators of that show, Damien Lentini, and him talking me through all of it, and realising that there had not been a major Al Anatsui show in the UK. And he was born part of the British Empire. I mean, it bust my mind. I couldn't understand why one of the major museums hadn't done this. And you were probably secretly working away in your Tate commission and planning it and wanting to do it. But I just thought, I was really struck by this and quite troubled, actually, to be honest, by this, given his biography, when there had been major museums everywhere else, really, in the world, but at that stage. I think it was one of the things that just created the conviction within me and then within Melissa and the rest of the team, who were like, right, we are going to pull this off somehow, find these works from across the UK, and in the end, him making a new work for it. But there was, it was quite something to understand that.
There's a natural pause. I'm going to take the opportunity to open up to questions. I think I've been really wrapped by this whole conversation and just really enjoying listening to you all. I've written down the word geography and geographical so many times. I really am amazed with the ways that you've all drawn together, thinking about the geography of Ghana, but also in relation to Edinburgh, and the way that both of these artists have responded to the context within these exhibitions, within which the exhibitions sit. That hasn't just been landed in Edinburgh. In fact, when I was writing the copy for this event, Fiona said to me, "We're not just hosting these exhibitions, you know, they are curated within the context of Edinburgh. Both exhibitions contain new work that was commissioned for Edinburgh, and both of these artists have thought about the Scottish context so deeply. And I think that's something that you've all brought out in what you've been saying. So thank you for that. But I'm going to, just checking the time, I think we've got about 15 minutes for questions. So if you do have any questions for any of the speakers or everyone, then this is your moment. And also online, if there are any online as well. Okay.
I think maybe while that goes
I'm going to pass this microphone over so we can all hear.
No, I was just reflecting on this idea of both gallery spaces being kind of changed by the presence of these works. And when I was in Edinburgh a few weeks ago, kind of walking through the quad and sort of seeing Anatsui's work, it really changes the way in which you read the quad, actually. The sort of entrance, the sort of procession onto an artwork, and that sort of, you want to get closer, you get closer, and sometimes you pull back from it, and each sort of turn of where you're situated or standing changes your appreciation of it, and also the kind of architecture. And I'm really intrigued by how perhaps the Fruitmarket Gallery is able to see that new space downstairs because of Ibrahim's work. And I think there's such a sort of directness and sort of poetry that I think only comes because these artists really are engaged with the sort of context they're working in, and that's the context when they're working in Ghana, in Nsukka, in Tamale, as well as working in Edinburgh. So their work is always very much rooted in the place that it is, and it affects that place and leaves a kind of trace beyond its kind of immediate presence.
I have had a couple of people criticise art, like, how is it taken, and there is something of what you were saying in this, how is it taken an African artist to come all the way over here and show us that the fruit market's relationship with the railway? No, like, well, I show every artist, where we cited. It's really, maybe he's looked and had that desire to engage with the site in a completely different way. And he's, as I say, he's taught us a lot, but he's made the steel room sing in a way that I don't think it won't again. Yeah. There's a microphone over there.
Hello.
Well, thank you so much for such interesting presentations and brilliant exhibitions, raising so many questions. So I'm just going to ask a quite particular one about alcohol and the meaning of the use of the bottle tops and so on in Anatsui in terms of the sort of present day relations of I don't know, class or gender or between Nigeria and Ghana. And the reason I'm asking that is partly because a sort of transnational perspective of different colonialisms. So that, when, for instance, I was in Brisbane, there was a fascinating exhibition I went to of Aboriginal art, and there you had, the debris of alcohol, if you like, being used. And the meaning there, obviously, is not just the sort of 18th century or 19th century use of alcohol to entrap and make sort of desperate. It's the perfect trade good, obviously, because you can never have enough of it and it weakens you. But there's an ongoing thing, clearly, in Australia, as in indigenous peoples in North America as well, the sort of situation with alcohol there. And clearly, Ghana, Africa, is very different, despite the similarities. And I suppose I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about that, the specificity, the sort of compare and contrast, if you like. What does it mean?
So I can say something about the use of bottle tops in Elle's work. They're mostly, you've got gin, whiskey, vodka, anything but soft drinks, which I find funny because presumably there are soft drink bottle caps, but he's not interested in those. So I think this fixation with alcohol is evidently a very pointed one because it animates so many of the histories that you were just pointing to. But I think one of the things that Elle is also really interested in is he's still an avid drinker of palm wine. I think he won't mind me saying this. And palm wine has a very important legacy within the context of colonial and post-colonial Ghana. It was one of the most popular sort of drinks and one of the most hard to come by, and as such often associated with the ancestors and actually pouring libations. And I think Elle has a kind of I wouldn't be able to say much about his personal connection to alcohol in general, but what I would say about the bottle tops is that procurement of the bottle tops is something that's actually become easier with time, which probably speaks to both their availability, but also the kind of growth of his project as an artist. But then in turn, when he invites you to look at the works, in depth, as you often can, you can literally see what's written on them. And I can't quote any of the names now, but sometimes you'll see the repetition. When you see black and gold, it's a particular brand. When it's a yellow bottle top, it's another one. But I once asked him about colour in his work, because he doesn't like when his works are referred to as kente cloths, which are these famous strip-woven cloths that are sort of indigenous to the Ashanti people of Ghana and more widely, actually, Ashanti people across West Africa. But I think what's fascinating is that he would use these primary colours because the colours red and yellow were often the ones that were most readily available. So some of these things we think are formal choices are actually quite arbitrary. It's like that's what was available, so I sort of began with that. And I think that there is maybe something about this idea of not wanting the works to be over-determined. He's never named a work, to my understanding, after a particular, liquor or brand, but they reveal themselves to you, in fact. But the first thing that you encounter is this field of colour, and there's this field of kind of visual texture that you then dive into. But I think there's yet to be, and I think one scholar's written in depth about the individual significance of the brands, but I think to Elle they are rather arbitrary because he thinks of them more in relation to colour rather than the brands that are revealed on the surface of each bottle top. That's almost a kind of a guessing game, I think, for the audience to then go down a rabbit hole and kind of seek more meaning in the works. But yeah.
The only thing I'd add to that, if you go back to what Osei was saying before about the education that Al had, and being a very British Royal College education, I remember him saying he was really irritated by having to use plaster of Paris that was imported into Ghana to make his early sculpture. I think he said it with you on stage at Tate, and started looking around for what he could use in his everyday life and what he could get his hands on, which is how he came to the trays that Osei was describing. But it was relatively soon after that he found this bag of bottle tops on a walk in Nigeria, and literally saying to himself, what can I do with this? So whilst he is not driving the production of alcohol in any way, we have to also remember these are surplus materials, these are reused, and it's a very sustainable practice in that way. He doesn't like it being reduced into that idea of recycling, and we won't use the word recycling actually, but it's really more like all of these surplus materials are valuable and they're being made anyway. So what can I make of them? It's quite alchemical.
Yeah.
I'm really intrigued by the sort of, I find it fascinating that this artwork sort of grows out of finding these bottle tops at a shrine house. Yeah. And one of the things I've been researching for a while is the Kumasi shrine houses, generally more kind of multi-generational ways of living across the African continent. But specifically in Ghana, the Asante region, there are these kind of shrine houses that I think there are 10 of them remaining, which are now UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And for me, they're super interesting places because there are ideas about dwelling and about sort of a spirituality and how people build. What I find fascinating about them is whenever you go, you offer a libation. And I remember recently visiting a few of them in Kumasi, and somebody jokingly saying, "Oh, the gods drink schnapps now," or "the gods drink gin now." So there's something I find really interesting about that sort of there's a kind of spirituality that is also tied not to the alcohol, but the sort of libations, the act of kind of remembering ancestors, remembering people, connections to a place. Yeah. And I was just really intrigued by that story about finding these bottle tops at an Igbo shrine house.
There's also just one more note. When we started working on the project at Tate, Elle mentioned that the first time he'd come across the Tate namesake was through Tate and Miles Sugar. And he said that was the immediate association that he'd made. But in Ghana during the independence period, it was, you know, common to have Kellogg's imported sugar, which were often seen as a sign of kind of middle class prosperity during that time, but also kind of a culture forced upon many Ghanaians and colonized subjects up to that point. So there is a way in which there is this kind of uneasy idea of the use of the commodity. I think it's why Elle always states quite proudly that these bottle tops are the product of Nigeria. It's a Nigerian industry that produces them, albeit one built on forms of colonial extraction. They exist in a kind of present tense. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for this conversation. Nana, you started to speak about the everyday materials as the living archives in art, and I think everybody on the panel has really spoken to that. I wonder if you could explore that more, because I think that there's a really interesting contrasting legibility of forms. I think as I've learned a lot more about, say, Ndinkra symbols, there's sometimes where I see them and they look illegible because the aphorisms don't read well as images. And I think some of that was in the tropical modernism, but just that differential legibility of forms versus text and archive and you know, video that I think is interesting here.
Yeah, for me, I find it really, this idea of what you archive and what tells a story of a place. And for me, it's to maybe talk a bit more about the Tropical Modernism exhibition. For me, what's interesting there is the ways in which there's a kind of official narrative. There's a story that is told, it gets told again, and becomes the sort of line that everyone sort of knows about a place, a situation, a certain given context. But then there are other things that also occur, and that's what I find really interesting, that way of seeing beyond the sort of official way of documenting, a kind of quite Western framework for how we keep memory, how we remember things that are important. And there's difference and in doing so, and I find that Ibrahim's work for me is really speaking about the different ways of collecting stories and shining light on other stories. So I started to talk a bit earlier about the sort of narrative of independence that sort of is devoid of the labour of everyday, that was for a long time devoid of the labour of everyday people. So the sort of, you know, real celebration of the big six or kind of really important sort of figures. But there's a labour that built a country, connected a country. I think it's also really interesting to think about Ghana as a country and the sort of formation of that. So you had the Gold Coast, but then you also had the British Northern Territory. So there weren't even really a sort of one whole country, that Ghana was born at independence. And there's a sort of labour from the British Northern Territories that was never really acknowledged in the sort of story of the Gold Coast. Actually, that's sort of the railways, the sort of extraction of material. That's a different archive, that's a different story that is not in the archive. So I think sort of finding traces of other stories through materiality, through these records, through the kind of movement of goods is another, it goes beyond the kind of pictorial, the textual, and gives you another way of reading into the past.
Yeah. And it's actually Elle's introduction to Adinkra signs came through textile initially, through the repeat of Adinkra symbols on kind of, I'm just trying to remember the name of the fabric, not Kente fabric, but the other kind. But that basically it was fabric that you'd often see elders wearing, or you would find it at the cultural centre in Kumasi. But he was actually interested in the fact that these symbols were becoming almost kind of divorced from day-to-day life. So it was about the kind of reincision of sort of ancestral knowledge systems and forms of spiritual knowledge back into a kind of contemporary idiom. So I think that, for Elle, that was kind of instrumental at that time, and obviously the bottle tops do something entirely different, but in the exhibition at Talbot Rice, you do have a moment where you get to see his early woodworks that bear many of those references to Adinkra symbols, although you'd have to kind of there is a famous Adinkra chart that you get when many people get when they're young, where you can then translate and look at them side by side. And Elle said something beautiful once about the fact that people will often comment, again, it's one of the lines that people often say that, Africa doesn't have written languages, that everything is oral, which of course is not true, because you've got all these forms of language that predated the colonial encounter. So if you take them seriously as legible, as forms of language that are there to be translated and decoded, the possibilities are endless as far as it relates to the contemporary as much as the past.
And I also find actually translating the Adinkra symbols, often the sort of written English form is so much less.
Yeah.
they lose something in the sort of literal translation. So there's something about what you are able to read in those languages, and if you take them seriously as languages, they are whole in that way.
Thank you. I was really interested in the idea of the artist creating a community of artists and in the area where they want to do that. I've been in Dundee today, and in Dundee it's a very old industrial heritage where there isn't very much work anymore in that area. So in areas of Dundee there is very little work, a lot of communities with very little work. And there's also the V&A, and there's a big kind of colonial heritage too there. So I was interested in how much these artists have to offer other towns and cities across the world.
I mean, maybe I'll go back to the formation of universities, because in the context of Nsukka and Kwame Nkrumah University, they're both, I think that Nsukka is not even a second city, Kumasi is a second city. I don't know what Nsukka is relative to Lagos or Abuja, but effectively as a result of not being capital cities, they are kind of often relegated, and as such don't receive the same amount of funding, commercial interest, investment, etc. And I think that the fact that El and Ibrahim alike have chosen strategically not to be in major city centres, I think speaks volumes about where they stand in relation to that question. But I would say that it's maybe, I'm just trying to think of an anecdote, because El's full of stories. I often ask him about why he chose Nsukka, and he's just said quite plainly, I don't want to misquote him, something to the effect that it felt like home. And I think these artists are doing something quite instrumental in the sense that they're making a sense of home where they are. They're not necessarily expecting to transform things overnight, per se, but this is real commitment to a kind of world building that suggests that when you have a community of people who are invested in an idea or a project, extraordinary things can happen. And I think when we think about the sort of, in so many ways, the project of civilization world over, you see this kind of ways in which you could say that kind of the coercive possibilities of the collective has been used to a kind of detrimental outcome. And then you see artists who are kind of reclaiming that, thinking about the possibilities of the railway, for example, which the government isn't really looking at. I don't know the Ghanaian government is thinking about, what about that abandoned railway that was, or the decommissioned planes, or the grain silos, all of these things that Ibrahim in particular is investing value into. So I think that for me is something that artists can take away from, or that cities and communities can take away from these works, is that the idea of a kind of small idea germinating. Because I remember when Ibrahim had to fight tooth and nail just to convince someone in Ghana to show his work, and it was sort of like, little did they know. And I think even today, and that speaks maybe to what you were talking about, Fiona, the slight sort of fracture between how his works are regarded internationally relative to how they looked upon in Ghana. It's not to say that people in Ghana don't put value in what Ibrahim are doing, but often the first question will be, well, does it make any money? What is it doing for me? What impact, what material impact is it having? So there is still, I think, some challenge around shifting the nature of what artists can perhaps, what value added can artists bring, but is there maybe a way of shifting also the idea of value that you've spoken about and everyone's referred to in lots of ways? I find it really interesting, actually, the way that Ibrahim conceptualizes this practice, this thing about adding value, and it really just reminded me of what you were saying earlier. I'm probably an architect because of
couldn't be an artist. That's just not going to be a conversation. So next thing, architect in an art school. But I think it's this thing of what value are you giving back, and the usefulness of art. I'm always really intrigued by how Ghanaians perceive art, something that is useful, that there's a sort of making that with one's hands, with as part of just your everyday. So the making of kente, the weaving, is art. So art is not something to be regarded in perhaps a kind of museum or gallery context, but it's the everyday. And I think that adding value is an appreciation of the everyday, that this has to be useful for a community. It has to be to bring, to speak just very matter of fact, it has to bring jobs, it has to bring economic prosperity, it has to be able to shift the sort of material sort of context of people in a community. And I think that investment in realising the role of an artist in the sort of, in terms of labour, in terms of thinking about economy is really important and can't be overlooked, especially in a context like in Ghana.
It is astonishing, isn't it, the confidence that Ibrahim had so young. And maybe it is because he was basically still at university when he hits the Venice Biennale with such a bang. But the confidence to start doing it and to say, well, where I come, he wasn't living there. He was born in Tamale, as I understand, hadn't been back there for someone. Like, I should do it there because there's nothing there. And I can go there and I can start something there. The confidence of that seems astonishing to me, and that sense that he's just going to do it by himself without any government help, without any intervention. It is, we could do with a bit of that.
and more connectivity. I mean, I always point, I think what Scotland does incredibly well, and I don't know that you all see this, but from the outside, the fact that Fiona and Tessa are here having this conversation across institutions that share audiences is critical, that more of that dialogue. I mean, I'm sure in a decade there'll be other artists either informed by or inspired by Ibrahim setting up their own institutions. If people here are more interested in this, there are resources that we can point you to where you can look at other artist-led organisations on the continent. But I would argue that those organisations are almost more important to certain sort of conceptions of the art world than museums or kind of private galleries, in terms of generating other possible futures. So I think there is a huge amount that Ibrahim's practice makes possible, and it's a kind of generational shift. Elle has recently returned to Ghana and is now setting up a foundation that if you happen to be visiting Accra, it's about an hour outside of Accra, you can go and visit. It's an extraordinary space that will be mostly there specifically for artists to practice. So I think if any of you are sort of interested in the future in spending more time in Ghana, I'm sure I can point you in the direction of those studios, because these are things that are happening for the first time.
And the economic impact that the artists are having, and particularly knowing a bit more about Al, he was given an honorary chieftainship in Nigeria when he was doing the Hasta Kunst exhibition, because of the economic impact that he made in the region. It's very rare, I think, for someone outside of Nigeria to be given such an honour.
It's rare for someone from outside that specific tribe or ethnic group to be given a chieftainship. I can't think of a parallel, but it's fascinating because I think for El, he's still called El of G, so El of Ghana, to his colleagues in Nsukka, who are mostly Igbo. And for those of you who know anything about the history of Nigeria, that means a lot, because ethnically to be Igbo means there's a kind of degree of separation because of the history of the Nigerian Civil War. So I think that there is maybe something about him being embraced as an outsider, which is again why he remained so long. I think he taught for 40 years or something and is now relocated to Ghana.
Sadly, I'm going to have to draw it to a close. I'm going to grab the microphone back. I'm sorry to have to cut things short there, because I could listen to you forever, but I think everyone probably wants to go and get their tea. So, but thank you so much for all those fascinating questions, and obviously that's enriched the conversation even more. There's a few things I want to say before we wrap up, which is that both Talbot Rice and Fruitmarket are producing books on the respective artists we've been talking about, which are neither of which have been published yet, but they are both available for pre-order on our website. So do look on Talbot Rice's website and Fruitmarket's website, and you can follow the appropriate links to find pre-order for the books. We will be launching our book at a talk with Ibrahim Mahama on the 5th of October, so do come along to that. We're really excited that he's coming back to talk in person here, so do join us. And Talbot Rice also have a really rich programme of events about the Anatsui exhibition, so do look at their website for that. There are Friday tours with lots of academics from Edinburgh University, so really fascinating different takes on the exhibition from different perspectives, so do look at those as well. And last but not least, please do fill in the comment form if you've got a moment to do that. It really helps us to have feedback on our events, what worked, what didn't work. We do read them, we do listen to them and act on things where we can. So thank you very much if you're able to do that. And thank you to all our speakers. It was just really fascinating to listen to you and a great way to celebrate both these exhibitions. So thank you.